Good morning and welcome to American Government here at Seaside High School. We are beginning Chapter 2, Section 1. We're going to talk about our political beginnings. If you'll see up on the walls, there are the objectives for this week. All 5 sections are written here on the big blue butcher paper. So you can always double check those to make sure that you are learning what you're supposed to be learning as we get through this week. I want to welcome you back from your weekend and hope you enjoyed yourselves. And as I mentioned last week, we'll start here with Chapter 2. As we do have a substitute today, we're going to go through this little video chat and get through at least one of these sections at this particular point in time. So here we go. Just reviewing the objectives. We will talk about the basic concepts of government that were held by the American colonists. Again, we're looking at this time period in U.S. history from really Jamestown in 1607 or the Pilgrims as they came over to Plymouth in 1620. And from that moment on, as the English were settling the Americas, all the way up through the American Revolution in 1776. So what were the colonists believing that a government needed to have, and how important was that to what they were doing in their daily lives? The next one, look at which important English documents have had the most influence on our government. So we'll look at the things that have influenced Great Britain's forms of government, and really we're looking at how did Great Britain restrict the power of the king through the years, and we'll start at 1215 all the way up through and just past the American Revolution. And how were the governments of the 13 colonies organized? So specifically we're looking at those 13 colonies and what did their governments look like. That's what we want to pull for this is what was that structure? Did it have a unitary system? Was it a federal system? Who was in power? And the things that we learned from Chapter 1 will be applied in this section here as we move through. So first we'll look at the basic concepts of government. The colonists, remember, are living on the continent of North America, and they're really far away from Great Britain. It's by a sailing ship, you're looking at 2 months by sea, both directions, and so anytime the colonists wanted to get something done or get governmental approval, it took a while. So they knew that they wanted some type of ordered system of government, and as we talked last week, we know that government provides law and order to help keep society moving in a direction that the vast majority of people would like to see it moving in. And the colonists didn't want to have that kind of outlaw type of mentality where everybody had to guard their own stuff and you could do whatever you wanted to. They wanted a system of laws that they could follow under the British Crown at the time, so they could feel safe in their pursuits of what they wanted to do and the possessions that they gain over time, that they could feel secure that those were going to be safe. The idea of limited government was something that had been springing up under the philosophical teachings of Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and the social contract theory, which we talked about again last week. This idea of limited governments, that government's not all powerful. So when we talked about rule of law last week, we were discussing the idea that government could only govern if it followed the same laws that the people had to follow. And of course, in a monarchy system, the power of the government isn't the same for the leadership as it is for the people living in that system. So the idea of limited government was something that the colonists had really grown on them. As I mentioned before, governmental decisions were a long ways away. So if the colonists wanted to put in, say, a well in the center of town and they needed governmental approval, they didn't want to wait 4 to 6 months for that to be approved. by the King of England, so they went ahead and made that decision and did it. They followed some kind of somewhat normal practices of, majority rules, and they're going to vote on the decision, and the majority of people approved. They would put it in and kind of then send away a little notice to the king, hey, we would like to do this, and eventually the notice would come back that, yeah, you're approved, and of course the well had probably already been in for 6 months. But they learned that they could govern themselves in a real positive way by getting officials to be elected by the colonists to make decisions. In the term would be like a governor or would be a representative, and they didn't always have to have the king make those decisions for them. The concept of representative government is that idea that the government's supposed to serve the people, and again, colonists were learning that if they chose people to represent them, that was a much more responsive government to their needs than it was having the king make decisions, because the people obviously coming from the regular society knew what the citizens were looking for and then made decisions based on what the will of the people wanted, and the people were happier because their decisions were being held up in government. So, going back through the basic concepts of government for the American colonists, there are 3 things that you want to have down, and you may want to underline these, is this ordered system, social system of government, then of course limited government, the idea of limited government, and that representative government. So let's do a formative assessment. So I'll give you a second here to get out your ABCD cards. And we'll pop this up on here on the screen. And our guest teacher today will be able to kind of go through this process and look and see where you're at. If we don't get an overwhelmingly positive turnout with our answers, then we'll go ahead and hit pause on my little presentation here, and you guys can rediscuss those 3 main concepts, and then you can catch back up with me as soon as you have that information down. Okay, here we go. The question is, what is the idea of limited government? And your responses are going to be, government works for the people. And remember not to show your ABCD card until after all of them have been shown here, all the answers. Government should not be all-powerful. Government should limit its actions to the needs of the majority. Or D, government governs best when left alone. Give you a second to think about that. Okay, and let's respond. So as we look around the room right now, we'll see where we're at, and hopefully we have everybody showing the letter B, as government should not be all-powerful. That's the idea of limited government. Okay, if we are not there, then let's go ahead and pause this statement, and we'll go back through and maybe reread section 1 in your textbooks. Okay, so let's look at important English documents. So the way our government works today can be traced to important documents over history, and what we're really focusing on here is the idea of limiting the power of government, and this concept of limited government. So in Great Britain, the king was in charge of society and really made all the rules, and whatever the king wanted, the king could pretty much get. Well, as time has gone on, the lords that were kind of advisors and really like an early parliament to the king were able to gain a little bit more power over time, and as King John comes into play in 1200 BC, his ability to control and lead was not very strong. So the lords saw an opportunity to really look at what the king does and make some decisions here that would benefit them by reducing the power of the king. And the first thing that was done is they forced King John to sign what's called the Magna Carta. And that document basically says that any of the lords that were accused of crimes would get a trial by jury as opposed to a trial and then the king make the decision on whether you're guilty or not. They were going to be provided with due process. So there was a process that had to be followed if they were accused of a crime. In order to be found guilty, you had to go through a process. And then the final one there was the right to private property. So in this time of kings and queens ruling Great Britain, the lords had property spread out throughout the entire kingdom that was theirs, but yet they were still responsible to the lords, the king, in their overall discussions. And again, private property is really important to these lords, as these were their possessions and their castles and their arms, and they wanted to hold on to those type of things and not have the king just say, I want to take that stuff. Now, the right to bear arms is something we'll deal with here in just a second, but just understanding that the property that they owned and the people that they had working that property, or basically the protection that they provided for the villagers that lived outside of their property, put them in a situation of acting like a state government, and the king being the national government. So there is kind of a setup of a hierarchy system here where power is distributed, but not in the sense that we think of it today. And then we move into the English Bill of Rights in 1689, and again, the trial by jury and the due process were refined a little bit more. There were more protections than created for people. Again, that due process is the process in which an accused person, the process must be followed before they can be accused or be found guilty of that crime. So if I was going to be arrested, say for murder, and the police came and told me that what I was being arrested for, told me that I had a right to a lawyer, told me that the things that I said could be used against me, and the process of going through court and me being allowed to have my witnesses to argue for my side of the case, and all those things are part of the due process that's outlined in our court system. And this is relatively new to the world, but it's something that the English felt was really, really important. So as they add things like no cruel and unusual punishment and no excessive bail or fines, one of the ways that the king would get around some of the due process is says, okay, well, we'll follow the process, but I'm going to put you in jail and your court case will be in 5 years. Or your bail is £2 million, and not being able to afford that type of bail to get out of jail just to wait until your court hearing was something that the king was able to manipulate, and it caused some issues for the lords. So they came back with this English Bill of Rights, and this is quite a few years later. 1689, we have colonists living in the Americas now for at least 60 years, and the colonization of the world by Great Britain is something that's happening everywhere. So the British government is really expanding apart on this global scale at this particular point in time, and the lords wanted to kind of be part of that benefit that was happening, and wanted to make sure that the king wasn't going to take stuff away from them. Another one here is the right to bear arms, so the ability to hold on to their weapons, and the right to petition. Again, prior to the right to petition, if you were upset with what the king did and you aired your grievance on a piece of paper and you got a bunch of people to sign it, then basically the king just had a list of people that were upset with him, and he could do what he wanted to do with that list, or remove those people from the earth, or put them in jail, or for speaking out against the king. But with this right to petition, it protected people to be able to stand up against the government. In 1776, with the Virginia Bill of Rights, it's the first state after the Declaration of Independence has been written and the colonies become states to create a Bill of Rights of their own. And in that, they included things that they felt were really important, because some of those violations were occurring to those citizens under British rule. and that was the no unreasonable search and seizures, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. If you know the Bill of Rights for the United States, the First Amendment is freedom of speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly are those 5 things. Religion being a really interesting one, because most countries around the world, the separation of the religious views and what the government wants to do, there isn't a separation. But here in the United States, we felt that was really important, that religious views do not get involved in government. And so you see that freedom of religion to be able to practice and whatever religion you want, and not have the government say this is the only religion that you can practice, is something that is different in the United States and very well respected within the members of the United States and the citizens. It's something that we believe very strongly and hold dear to. And then in 1791, kind of completing the timeline here, is the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. And you'll notice that's quite a few years later than 1776 that the Bill of Rights was actually added to the U.S. Constitution. And again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Just, again, understanding all of these steps have been put together to limit the power of the government, to keep the government from making decisions that weren't within what the people wanted. And again, this is a new concept. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau are the kind of the forefathers on this philosophical idea, and it really shapes the way the U.S. government is going to be created. Okay, so we'll move on here to the 13 colonies themselves. Now, what we want to look at is, in these colonies, there are 13 of them, and they were set up in different ways with kind of different goals in mind. And of course, most of the colonies were set up with the idea of making money for the British government, the British crown. When I say the government in Great Britain, we're talking about the king. It's synonymous. It's the same person. So the 3 types of colonies that we found in North America at the time are a royal, proprietary, and a charter. And here are the differences in those. Royal colonies were ruled directly by the king. Now, the king himself would appoint someone to be in charge, a governor to be in charge of the colony, but the decisions that were being made were all run through the king. And as we mentioned earlier about the kind of putting a well in and not having the time to wait for that to happen, the person that would be put in charge for the king would start making decisions and kind of hope that those were in line with what the king was wanting to have happen at the time. Another type of colony was where the king granted people in North America this proprietary colony. And so it was land given to a person. One of the most notable ones is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a proprietary colony. It was given to William Penn, this big tract of land. And the idea here was a business venture for the king. He gave this land to one of the colonists. The colonists would then cultivate the land, take the resources off of that, sell those, and then make money. And then the king would get some of that money, kind of like investing in a company. But rather than the king having to be in total control of that particular piece of property, he had someone else was in charge, but he was still reaping the benefits financially from that. And the last one is the charter colony. Now, a charter, as we've talked about a constitution before, a charter is a constitution without sovereignty. So let me say that again. A charter is a constitution without sovereignty. And remember, sovereignty is that ability to choose what type of government you want. And so like the United States has sovereignty, so it has a constitution. The states all have a little bit of sovereignty, so they have a constitution. The Clatsop County has a charter. The city of Seaside has a charter. It's the rules that the city or the county are going to operate by, but yet it doesn't have any sovereignty. So in these charter colonies, Rhode Island, Connecticut were the two. They were really self-governed. They were given a charter to create an area of land and put those four characteristics together with the sovereignty and the government and land and population to create kind of like a little country. But it wasn't direct rule from the crown. The crown or the king gave specific guidelines of which the colony had to follow, so as long as they made their decisions within those guidelines, they were okay. And they got to make their own decisions. They had self-representation, they elected their own officials, they had a legislative branch, they had an executive branch, and they basically had a little, kind of like a little model statehood of what our states are like today. But this was 150 years before the Declaration of Independence. So what it gave the colonists the opportunity to do was to learn how to govern themselves, learn that they didn't need a king to tell them what to do. They could do it themselves. And so they gained a lot of confidence by this. And you add in the fact that the distance between Great Britain and the United States to get things done, or sorry, not the United States, but the colonies, so to get things done was great, which created a lot of opportunity for self-rule. So let's do another formative assessment. We'll get out your A, B, C, D cards again. Give you a second here to get those out. And you can see the question on the board here is, what are the three types of colonies? And again, our guest teacher will stop this presentation if we're not all on the same page and go back through a couple of things to make sure that we're doing well. So the question is, what are the three types of colonies in North America? Are they private, communal, and religious? Are they proprietary, royal, and religious? Are they charter, communal, and royal? And your choice for letter D is royal, charter, and proprietary. Okay, so let's respond. See what you have. Looking around the room. All right, hopefully we are all choosing the letter D, royal, charter, and proprietary colonies. Okay, if we need to stop this presentation and review that, let's go ahead and do that now, and we'll pick up with you here in just a second. Hey, welcome back. Let's look at a couple of more reviews here for section 1. So you can keep your ABCD cards out. And let's look at question 1 here. It says, all of the following are basic concepts of government brought to the colonies by English settlers except. Now, this is the first time we've had an except question really in this class. So when we see that, we should really say it again, because we're looking for something opposite of what our brain is thinking we're looking for. All of the following are basic concepts of government brought to the colonies by English settlers except. So is it the need for limited government, the need for a representative government, the need for an autocratic government, or the need for an ordered social system? So go ahead and get out your cards and let's respond now. And hopefully we have all picked the autocratic government. Letter C is the one that the colonists were not using when they came over and started to set up their own colonies. They were looking for a limited government that's representative to have an ordered social system. All right, question number 2. Which of the following was not one of the rights granted in the Magna Carta? So if you remember, there were a few things that were listed out in the Magna Carta which ultimately limited government of the king and basically helped out the lords. And our answers are the right to private property, the right to a trial by jury, the right to freedom of religion, the right to undergo due process of law. And hopefully you've chosen letter C. That is the freedom of religion, which came later under the English Bill of Rights. Okay, great. So that would conclude section 1 of chapter 2. At this point in time, we will work on some type of activity to shore up what we've learned here, and we'll proceed with section 2 shortly.